Hey everyone! If you enjoy these story videos, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world and keeps us creating more amazing stories every week. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. The relentless hum of New York City traffic was usually a comforting lull for Alex. For years of marriage to Sarah had been a whirlwind of shared dreams, laughter echoing through their stylish Brooklyn brownstone, and the quiet intimacy of two souls perfectly attuned. Or so he thought. Lately, that hum felt more like a discordant drone, a constant reminder of the growing distance between them. It had started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Sarah, a driven architect with an impressive portfolio, had always been dedicated to her work. But the late nights had become more frequent, the excuses of tight deadlines and demanding clients sounding increasingly hollow. Her once vibrant presence in their home was now fleeting, a shadow that flitted in and out, leaving behind a faint scent of expensive perfume and an unspoken tension. Dinners, once a cherished ritual, were often eaten alone by Alex, the silence amplifying his growing unease. Their evenings, once filled with comfortable silences or animated conversations about their day, were now punctuated by Sarah's phone calls, whispered apologies for being late, or her tired pronouncements of needing an early night. The spark that had once ignited their passion seemed to have dwindled to a flicker, threatening to extinguish completely. Their physical intimacy, once effortless and passionate, had become strained, a chore rather than a connection. Alex found himself yearning for the touch, the warmth, the sheer presence of his wife, but she seemed to exist in a different orbit, always just out of reach. He tried to talk to her, to bridge the chasm that was forming between them. "Is everything all right, love?" he'd ask, his voice laced with concern. Sarah would offer a tight, almost practiced smile. "Of course, Alex. Just a lot on my plate at work. You know how it is." He didn't know how demanding her job could be, but this felt different. This felt like a wall, not just a busy period. One crisp autumn morning, the air still holding the scent of damp leaves and distant wood smoke, Alex was preparing for his bi-weekly fishing trip to the tranquil waters upstate. It was his escape, his therapy, a chance to clear his head from the anxieties that gnawed at him. He packed his tackle box, checked his bait, and even laid out his lucky fishing hat. As he reached the door, a sudden wave of annoyance washed over him. He'd forgotten his favorite fly rod, a vintage bamboo piece Sarah had gifted him on their second anniversary. It was in the study, where he'd been admiring it the night before. Sighing, he turned the key in the lock, the click echoing unnervingly in the quiet apartment. He pushed open the heavy front door, expecting the usual silence of an empty home. Instead, a faint murmur reached his ears, a soft, almost hushed sound that sent a jolt of ice through his veins. It wasn't the television, nor the radio. It was human. He moved cautiously, his heart beginning to pound an erratic rhythm against his ribs. The sound seemed to be coming from their bedroom. A cold dread began to coil in his stomach. He pictured Sarah, perhaps just getting ready for work, though it was unusually early for her to be back after leaving hours ago. He pushed the thought aside, trying to rationalize, to find a harmless explanation. As he neared the bedroom door, the murmurs grew slightly louder, accompanied by a soft rustling. He paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob, a knot of sickening certainty tightening in his gut. The door was ajar, just a sliver, and through the gap, he saw a flash of movement, a tangle of limbs, a glimpse of disheveled clothes. His blood ran cold. Inside, Sarah and her lover, Mark, were caught in a moment of passionate abandon. The world had narrowed to the confines of their embrace, their senses alight, everything else a distant hum. Sarah's professional facade had crumbled, replaced by a raw, uninhibited desire. Mark's hands were tangled in her hair, his breath hot against her ear. The thrill of the forbidden, the dangerous edge of deceit, had propelled them into a fever pitch. Then, the click of the front door. It had been faint, almost imperceptible over their heightened senses, but it had registered. Sarah's eyes, wide with sudden terror, flew open. Mark, more attuned to the subtle shifts in their surroundings, felt her sudden rigidity. He looked at her, confusion clouding his features, before seeing the panic etched on her face. "What is it?" he whispered, his voice rough with lingering passion. Sarah's breath hitched. "Alex," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper, a stark, chilling realization dawning on them both. Panic, raw and visceral, seized them. They scrambled apart, a frantic tangle of limbs and gasps. Clothes were strewn across the floor, a testament to their hurried passion. In that split second, a primal instinct surged through Sarah, a desperate, illogical plea for escape. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, a solution, anything to prevent the inevitable. It was then, in that moment of absolute desperation, that an ancient, almost forgotten instinct, dormant within her lineage, flared to life. A faint tremor ran through the room, a brief shimmer in the air. Mark, bewildered and disoriented, felt a dizzying lurch, as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis. Simultaneously, a faint glow emanated from Sarah's hand, where a small, intricately carved silver ring she always wore, a family heirloom, pulsed with an eerie, unearthly light. A strange energy crackled between them, a silent hum that intensified until it reached a peak, then abruptly dissipated. Mark blinked, his mind reeling. He looked at his hands. They were different. Smaller. Daintier. He looked at Sarah, but it wasn't Sarah. It was him. His own face stared back at him, wide-eyed and terrified. Sarah, now in Mark's body, felt a wave of nausea. She looked down at her, his hands, then at her, his reflection in the dresser mirror. A jolt of pure horror coursed through her. She was in Mark's body and Mark was in hers. The footsteps outside the bedroom door grew louder, closer. The reality of their predicament, horrifying as it was immediately superseded by the imminent danger of discovery. Alex was almost here. Mark, now inhabiting Sarah's body, his mind still reeling, was surprisingly quick-witted. The years of navigating complex business deals, of maintaining a cool facade under pressure, kicked in. He saw the doorknob beginning to turn. "Quick," Sarah hissed, her voice surprisingly steady despite the internal chaos. "Get dressed." "Now." Sarah grabbed a crumpled shirt and trousers from the floor, thrusting them at Sarah, Mark. The door began to open. Mark, now Sarah, forced a sickly sweet smile onto her face. She took a deep, shaky breath and, with a practiced ease that belied the absolute pandemonium within, she swung the door open wider, meeting Alex's gaze with a feigned surprise that, for a moment, seemed utterly convincing. "Alex, darling, you're back," Sarah exclaimed, a touch of practiced annoyance in her voice. "You forgot something, I presume?" "I was just getting ready for a very important call." She gestured vaguely towards the disheveled bed, hoping it looked more like the aftermath of a hurried morning than a clandestine rendezvous. Alex stood frozen in the doorway, his fishing rod still in his hand, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the crumpled clothes, the slightly flushed faces, the air thick with something he couldn't quite name. His initial suspicion had been confirmed, yet the scene before him, while unsettling, didn't scream affair. Sarah did look flustered, but she often did when rushing. The clothes on the floor, well, they were usually untidy. And who is that man? He hadn't noticed him at first. "Mark," Alex said, his voice laced with confusion. "What are you doing here?" Mark was a colleague of Sarah's, a rival architect from a competing firm, though Alex knew they sometimes collaborated on industry projects. He had seen him at company events, but never in their bedroom. Mark, in Sarah's body, forced another smile, a little too wide, a little too bright. "Alex. Good morning. Sarah called me in early for an emergency project brief. Massive client presentation today. You know how it is." She tried to sound casual, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. Sarah, in Mark's body, still struggling with the reality of her predicament, stumbled out from behind Mark. Sarah, now fully dressed, though his movements were awkward and uncoordinated. She avoided Alex's gaze, her his face still pale with shock. Alex's eyes narrowed. Something was off. Terribly, horribly off. The way Mark was moving, the unusual stiffness in his posture, the way Sarah, was talking, a slight tremor in her voice, an uncharacteristic nervousness in her eyes, and the way they were looking at each other, a flicker of shared terror, quickly masked. But before Alex could articulate his suspicions, a memory, sharp and vivid, flashed through his mind. A dusty, leather-bound book, its pages brittle with age, discovered in a forgotten corner of an antique shop upstate months ago. A strange, almost whimsical inscription on its first page, promising transformations. He had dismissed it as folklore, a charming piece of literary history. But now, a cold, calculating glint entered Alex's eyes. The cracks in the facade were far deeper than he'd imagined, and he suddenly understood, with a chilling certainty, that this was no ordinary affair. This was something far more twisted, far more profound. And the game, he realized, had just begun. He forced a smile, a chillingly calm expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. Right. An emergency brief. Of course. Well, I'll just grab my rod then. He walked past them, his gaze lingering on each of them for a fraction of a second too long, a silent acknowledgement of the charade he had just witnessed. As he entered the study, his hand went to the bookshelf, not for his fishing rod, but for that ancient, unsettling book. The game was on, and Alex, it seemed, had a very different kind of fish to fry. The air in the Brooklyn brownstone, usually filled with the comforting scent of brewing coffee and blooming flowers, now hung heavy with unspoken tension, a palpable unease that permeated every room. Alex, outwardly calm, moved through his days with a chilling meticulousness. He observed, he analyzed, he pretended. The fishing trip had been abandoned, his mind far too occupied with the unsettling scene he had walked into. Sarah, now in Mark's body, and Mark, now in Sarah's body, were a chaotic ballet of missteps and forced smiles. Sarah, trapped in Mark's larger, less agile frame, struggled with even the simplest tasks. Her movements were clumsy, her once graceful gestures replaced by a lumbering awkwardness. She knocked over coffee cups, fumbled with car keys, and constantly bumped into furniture. Her voice, usually soft and melodic, was now Mark's deeper, more resonant baritone, a jarring echo that made her wince every time she spoke. The subtle nuances of her facial expressions, once a window to her thoughts, were lost in a face that wasn't hers. Mark, conversely, found himself in a body that felt alien, yet strangely familiar. He had to consciously soften his movements, modulate his voice to Sarah's higher register, and adopt her more delicate mannerisms. He stumbled over heels, felt uncomfortable in her clothes, and struggled with the delicate artistry of her makeup routine. The weight of her hair, the shape of her hands, the subtle sway of her hips, all were foreign, yet he was forced to inhabit them, to become Sarah. Their interactions with Alex were a masterclass in forced normalcy. Mark, as Sarah, maintained a facade of affectionate nonchalance, though her eyes were always darting, always checking for Alex's reactions. She cooked meals she had no idea how to prepare, resulting in culinary disasters that Alex politely, almost too politely, ate. She tried to engage in conversations about his work, fabricating elaborate stories about architectural projects that sounded plausible enough, yet lacked the genuine passion Sarah usually exuded. Sarah, as Mark, was tasked with maintaining a lower profile. She would visit the brownstone ostensibly to discuss work projects with Sarah, their conversations stilted and overly formal. Alex would often join them, offering pointed observations or seemingly innocent questions that sent silent darts of panic between the two lovers. One evening, Alex found Mark, as Sarah, fumbling with a delicate pearl necklace that Sarah usually wore. Mark, as Sarah, dropped it, the pearls scattering across the polished hardwood floor. "Oh, darling, clumsy me," she exclaimed, bending down with an exaggerated show of dismay. Alex watched, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "You know, Sarah, you've always been so meticulous with your jewelry." Is everything all right? You seem a little off your game lately. Mark, as Sarah, froze for a fraction of a second, her mind racing. Just a long day, Alex. My hands are still a bit shaky from that client presentation. She forced a laugh that sounded a little too high-pitched, a little too strained. Meanwhile, Sarah, as Mark, was grappling with the profound psychological toll of the body swap. The constant fear of exposure, the internal battle with a voice and body that were not her own, was slowly eroding her sanity. She missed her life, her identity, her very self. She hated the coarse stubble on her, his chin, the broadness of his shoulders, the unfamiliar scent of Mark's cologne that clung to him. She saw the lingering desire in Mark's, as Sarah's, eyes when she looked at Alex, a desire that was now directed at Mark's body, and a wave of revulsion would wash over her. The lovers, once consumed by passion, now found their relationship poisoned by the desperate need for secrecy and the sheer discomfort of their new realities. Their clandestine meetings, once filled with stolen kisses and whispered promises, were now a frantic attempt to coordinate their charade, to iron out the inconsistencies, to ensure Alex remained oblivious. But the cracks were widening, and Alex was carefully documenting every single one. Alex, in the privacy of his study, began to meticulously cross-reference the archaic text of the ancient book with Sarah's recent, erratic behavior. The book, titled Echoes of the Soul, spoke of a rare, powerful bloodline capable of transient spirit transference, often triggered by extreme emotional states and the presence of a conduit, an object attuned to the user's lineage. He remembered the silver ring Sarah always wore, the one that had pulsed with an eerie glow the morning he walked in. It all clicked into place. He devoured the ancient script, painstakingly translating its obscure Latin passages, learning about the rituals, the catalysts, and, crucially, the vulnerabilities of this arcane magic. A grim determination settled over him. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his life, his wife, and exposing the betrayal that had shattered his world. One afternoon, Alex decided to escalate his game. He set up a hidden camera in the living room, subtly disguised as a decorative ornament. He knew he couldn't confront them directly yet. He needed irrefutable proof, and he needed to understand the full extent of their deception. That evening, he announced a surprise dinner reservation at a fancy Italian restaurant, a place Sarah usually adored. Mark, as Sarah, looked visibly uncomfortable. "Oh, darling, that's sweet. But I really have a mountain of work to do." Alex smiled, his eyes glinting. "Nonsense, Sarah. You've been working too hard. We deserve a night out. Besides," he added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "I saw Mark earlier, and he mentioned he was hoping to catch up with you about a project. I told him he should drop by for a drink before dinner. A quick work chat, then we can head out." Panic flashed in Mark's as Sarah's eyes. Mark, as Mark, but really Sarah, was already on her way over. This was a nightmare. They couldn't possibly maintain the charade with all three of them in the same room, under Alex's watchful eye, for an extended period. The risk of exposing their body swap was too great. When Sarah, as Mark, arrived, the tension in the room was suffocating. Alex, ever the gracious host, offered her, a whiskey. Sarah, as Mark, took a sip, trying to appear nonchalant, but the unfamiliar burn of the alcohol in Mark's throat made him, wince almost imperceptibly. "So, Mark," Alex began, leaning forward, "Sarah here has been telling me all about this fascinating new project you two are collaborating on. The Viridian Tower, I believe she called it." Mark, as Sarah, shot a desperate glance at Sarah, as Mark, who was now visibly sweating. Neither of them had ever mentioned a Viridian Tower. They had been so consumed with keeping up appearances that their fabricated work stories were now colliding. Yes. The Viridian Tower." Mark, as Sarah, blustered, trying to buy time. "A truly groundbreaking concept. Mark, perhaps you can elaborate on the structural innovations we're planning." Sarah, as Mark, cleared his throat, his mind a frantic scramble. "The structural innovations. Yes. Well, you see, the stress points are unique. She stammered, her voice deeper than Sarah's, a stark contrast to the elegant architectural jargon Alex was used to hearing from his wife. Alex chuckled softly, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. Unique indeed. And the projected timeline for this groundbreaking project? Sarah mentioned it was rather ambitious. Mark as Sarah and Sarah as Mark exchanged another panicked look. They were sinking, and Alex was holding the ropes. The dinner, the drinks, the seemingly innocent questions, it was all a trap. As the evening wore on, Alex continued his subtle interrogation, weaving questions that exposed the inconsistencies in their fabricated stories, highlighting the discrepancies in their personalities. He watched as Mark, as Sarah, struggled to recall details of Sarah's past, and as Sarah, as Mark, awkwardly tried to engage in Mark's architectural banter. The hidden camera whirred silently, capturing every telling glance, every strained smile, every moment of their elaborate deception. By the time Alex finally led Mark, as Sarah, and Sarah, as Mark, out the door, promising another work dinner soon, the air was thick with their barely contained terror. They knew, in their gut, that Alex knew something. But they couldn't possibly fathom the depth of his knowledge, or the chilling plan he was meticulously orchestrating. Alex returned to his study, the ancient book spread open on his desk. He reviewed the footage from the hidden camera, a cold, satisfied smile spreading across his face. The transformation, it seemed, was more than just physical. It was psychological, a slow, agonizing unraveling of their true selves. And he, Alex, was enjoying every moment of watching them squirm. The drama, he realized, was just getting started. The charade had become an agonizing dance, a suffocating performance where every step was fraught with the danger of exposure. Mark, in Sarah's body, and Sarah, in Mark's body, found themselves increasingly isolated, their worlds shrinking to the frantic whispers they exchanged in hurried phone calls and stolen moments. Alex, a silent puppet master, continued to pull the strings, his calm demeanor more terrifying than any outburst. Mark, as Sarah, struggled daily to embody the woman he had betrayed. She hated Sarah's high heels, her preference for delicate teas over strong coffee, and the constant need to feign interest in her social circle. The intellectual conversations about art and literature that Sarah had once effortlessly engaged in now felt like an impossible hurdle. Her professional life was a minefield. Colleagues at Sarah's architectural firm noticed subtle changes, a new bluntness in her, his communication, a less intuitive grasp of design concepts, a marked impatience that was uncharacteristic of the usually composed Sarah. She started making small, but significant, errors in project proposals, which fortunately, his team attributed to stress. Sarah, as Mark, fared no better. She found Mark's body to be a constant source of discomfort. The rough edges of his world, the aggressive business meetings, the competitive bravado, the casual sexism of some of his male colleagues, grated on her. She missed her own delicate hands, her familiar scent, the nuanced way she could express herself. She felt trapped in a costume that was too big, too loud, too male. His performance at Mark's firm was equally strained. His innate empathy and collaborative spirit clashed with Mark's cutthroat approach, raising eyebrows among her associates. Their illicit rendezvous, once charged with a dangerous thrill, were now desperate strategy sessions. He knows Mark. Sarah, as Mark, hissed one afternoon in a secluded park, his voice hoarse with fear. He has to. The way he looks at us, the questions he asks. Mark, as Sarah, ran a delicate hand, Sarah's hand, through her hair, a gesture that was unsettlingly feminine. We're being careful, Sarah. He's just suspicious. He doesn't know. But even as she said it, a cold dread gnawed at him. Alex's eyes held a knowledge that went beyond mere suspicion. Alex, meanwhile, delved deeper into the ancient book. He discovered intricate diagrams, elaborate incantations, and disturbing historical accounts of similar body swaps. The magic, he learned, wasn't permanent by default. It required sustained intent and a constant reinforcing ritual. More importantly, he found a section dedicated to reversal. A complex, dangerous ritual that could return the souls to their rightful bodies, but with a significant risk of unintended consequences. The book hinted at the possibility of a fractured mind, a permanent loss of self, or even a complete dissolution of the soul. A dark satisfaction bloomed within Alex. He had the means not just to punish, but to utterly dismantle their lives. His revenge would be slow, precise, and exquisitely painful. He began to leave subtle clues around the house, testing their reactions. He'd accidentally leave the ancient book open on his desk, its cryptic symbols facing upwards. He'd bring up esoteric topics at dinner, watching for their discomfort. One evening, he watched as Mark, as Sarah, meticulously arranged flowers in a vase, a task Sarah had always loved. But Mark, as Sarah, placed them in a way that was slightly off, an aesthetic discord that Sarah would have never tolerated. "You know, darling," Alex remarked casually, "your touch with flowers seems to have evolved. It's almost bolder now." Mark, as Sarah, flinched, nearly pricking herself on a rose thorn. "Oh, just trying a new style, Alex. Keeping things fresh." She forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Sarah, as Mark, watched from the doorway, a knot of despair tightening in his stomach. Every moment was a performance, every interaction a lie. She yearned for the comfort of her own skin, the familiarity of her own thoughts. She missed the ease of being herself. The body of Mark, once a vessel for illicit passion, now felt like a prison. The pressure began to show. Mark, as Sarah, started drinking heavily, seeking solace in the numbing haze of alcohol. Her once impeccable appearance became slightly disheveled. She snapped at Alex, then immediately apologized with exaggerated contrition. Sarah, as Mark, became withdrawn, haunted by nightmares, losing weight as she struggled to eat and sleep. The stress was taking a severe toll on both their physical and mental well-being. The pinnacle of Alex's manipulative game came during a dinner party they hosted for some of their closest friends. Alex had invited Sarah's boss, a formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, and Mark's most important client, Mr. Henderson, a notoriously shrewd businessman. The stage was set for maximum discomfort. "So, Sarah," Eleanor began, turning to Mark, as Sarah, "I've been meaning to discuss your proposal for the Hudson Yards project. Your recent revisions were unexpected. A little less of your usual finesse, I felt." Mark, as Sarah, swallowed hard, her mind a blank. She had barely glanced at the Hudson Yards proposal. "Oh yes, Eleanor. Just exploring some bolder conceptual approaches. Pushing the boundaries, you know." She tried to sound confident, but her voice wavered. Then, Mr. Henderson turned to Sarah, as Mark. "Mark, I heard you had some fascinating new ideas for the corporate campus design. My team was particularly intrigued by your emphasis on collaborative spaces. A departure from your usual focus on efficiency, I must say." Sarah, as Mark, felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He had indeed been pushing for more collaborative spaces, a reflection of her own design philosophy, not Mark's. He mumbled something about evolving design principles, but his words lacked conviction. Alex watched them both, his eyes sparkling with a dark amusement. He interjected with pointed questions, subtly highlighting the inconsistencies, creating an atmosphere of palpable tension. "Interesting," he'd say, "Sarah. I thought you always believed that efficiency was paramount in corporate architecture." Or, "Mark, isn't it true that you once dismissed collaborative spaces as inefficient distractions?" The two lovers felt like insects under a magnifying glass, squirming under Alex's relentless, quiet scrutiny. Their friends, sensing the strange undercurrents, exchanged uneasy glances. Eleanor and Mr. Henderson, astute professionals, picked up on the subtle shifts in Sarah's and Mark's personalities, though they couldn't quite place the source of the discomfort. By the end of the evening, the air was thick with their barely concealed desperation. As their guests departed, a heavy silence descended upon the brownstone. Mark, as Sarah, collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands. "I can't do this anymore, Sarah," she groaned. "He's toying with us. He knows." Sarah, as Mark, stood by the window, staring out at the glittering New York skyline. His reflection a distorted image of a man he wasn't. "We have to figure out a way out of this, Mark, before he destroys us completely." Alex, from the doorway of his study, watched them. The satisfaction was immense. He had them exactly where he wanted them. They were unraveling, piece by agonizing piece. But his ultimate revenge was yet to come. He closed the ancient book with a soft thud, a sinister smile playing on his lips. The game was far from over. The brownstone, once a sanctuary of love, had become a battleground, its silent skirmishes more brutal than any overt conflict. Mark, as Sarah, and Sarah, as Mark, were spiraling, their identities blurring, their once solid sense of self fracturing under the relentless pressure. Alex, witnessing their disintegration, felt a cold, hard satisfaction bloom in his chest. Mark, as Sarah, grew increasingly erratic. She began making impulsive decisions at Sarah's firm, leading to heated arguments with colleagues. Her once meticulous attention to detail vanished, replaced by a careless disregard for deadlines and client expectations. She frequently forgot important events, missed appointments, and exhibited fits of temper that were shockingly out of character for the usually calm and composed Sarah. The team, initially attributing it to stress, was now openly concerned. Eleanor Vance, Sarah's boss, called Alex, expressing her worries about Sarah's drastic personality shift. Alex, feigning concern, offered vague reassurances, subtly fueling her suspicions. Sarah, as Mark, was suffering a deeper, more internal torment. He felt a profound sense of loss, a disconnection from everything that made her, her. The constant need to inhabit Mark's aggressive persona was exhausting. He found himself, struggling with basic emotions, unable to access his usual empathy or joy. Her work at Mark's firm became mechanical, devoid of passion, leading to a noticeable decline in her performance. Her colleagues started to notice her unusual quietness, her lack of drive, and a strange, almost melancholic air that replaced Mark's usual swagger. Their clandestine meetings became frantic, desperate affairs. "We have to do something, Mark." Sarah, as Mark, pleaded one evening, his voice breaking. "I can't live like this anymore. I don't even recognize myself." Mark, as Sarah, stared blankly at her eyes hollow. "What can we do, Sarah? He has us cornered. We're trapped." She had stopped trying to maintain Sarah's persona entirely when alone with him, slipping into her own frustrated gestures and deeper voice. Meanwhile, Alex was meticulously planning his next move. He had translated the reversal ritual from Echoes of the Soul. It was complex, requiring specific lunar phases, rare botanical components, and a precise sequence of incantations. It also required a conduit, the same silver ring that had initiated the swap. The most crucial and terrifying element was the willing heart, the consent of the original soul to return. The book warned that forcing a soul back could result in catastrophic consequences, potentially destroying both souls. A cruel smile played on Alex's lips. He didn't want to destroy them completely. He wanted them to suffer the return, to remember the agony of their betrayal, to live with the consequences of their actions. He decided to leave a few more clues for them, hints about the book and its contents, to push them towards the realization of what had truly happened. He strategically left photocopies of certain pages of the ancient book, the ones describing body transference and the concept of a magical conduit, on his desk. He underlined key phrases and circled the image of a ring remarkably similar to Sarah's heirloom. He wanted them to find it, to put the pieces together, and to realize the true nature of their predicament. One afternoon, while Alex was out on a run, Mark, as Sarah, crept into his study, driven by a growing, desperate curiosity. She had noticed the book before, but dismissed it as Alex's eccentric reading material. Now, the open pages, the the circled passages, the image of the ring, a cold, horrifying realization began to dawn. She snatched up the photocopies, his, hands trembling, and rushed to meet Sarah as Mark. Look, she whispered, thrusting the papers at him. Look at this. He knows, Sarah. He knew all along. Sarah, as Mark read the pages, his eyes widening with a mixture of terror and dawning comprehension. The descriptions of soul transference, the role of an emotional trigger, the mention of a powerful conduit, it all fit. The glowing ring, the desperate moment of their switch. It wasn't an accident. It was magic. And Alex somehow was behind it. A new kind of fear, cold and insidious, settled over them. They weren't just caught in an affair, they were pawns in Alex's elaborate, magical revenge. The humiliation, the psychological torture, the slow unraveling of their lives, it was all orchestrated. He did this to us, Sarah, as Mark breathed, his voice barely audible. He switched us. Mark, as Sarah nodded, her face pale. And if he can switch us, he can switch us back. A flicker of desperate hope, mixed with overwhelming terror, appeared in her eyes. They spent days secretly poring over the photocopied pages, trying to decipher the ancient language, piecing together the fragments of the ritual. The complexity daunted them, but the desire to escape their prisons was a powerful motivator. They began to understand the concept of a reversal ritual, the moon phases, the botanical components. But the willing heart clause remained a terrifying mystery. How could they force Alex to will them back, especially if he was behind the whole thing? Alex, observing their furtive meetings and whispered conversations, watched them from a distance, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He knew they had found the clues. He knew they were beginning to understand. The anticipation of their next move, the desperate attempts they would make, fueled his dark delight. He decided to make the reversal even more appealing, yet more terrifying. He subtly mentioned an upcoming full moon at dinner, a seemingly innocuous comment that sent a jolt through Mark as Sarah, and Sarah as Mark. He started leaving various exotic herbs around the house, some of the very components mentioned in the reversal ritual, feigning a sudden interest in herbal teas or aromatherapy. One morning, Alex forgot to lock his study door. Mark, as Sarah, driven by a powerful impulse, crept in. On the desk, prominently displayed, was a detailed illustration from the book, depicting the full reversal ritual, complete with its potential dangers. But Alex had strategically altered one crucial detail in his copy. He had removed the part about the willing heart, making it seem as if the ritual only required the conduit and the other components, not the consent of the original body. Mark, as Sarah, snatched up the illustration, her heart pounding. She now believed they had all the pieces. She showed it to Sarah as Mark, their faces alight with a desperate, dangerous hope. We can do this, Sarah, Mark, as Sarah, whispered, her voice filled with a newfound determination. We can switch back. We just need the ring and the rest of the ingredients. He won't know what hit him. But Alex knew. He watched them, unseen, his plan unfolding perfectly. He wanted them to attempt the ritual, to believe they were regaining control. Because he had another twist in mind, a final, devastating blow that would ensure his revenge was complete and their betrayal eternally punished. The true meaning of unintended consequences was about to be revealed, and Alex was ready to witness it unfold. The discovery of the reversal ritual ignited a desperate, flickering hope in Mark, as Sarah, and Sarah, as Mark. The illusion of escaping Alex's cruel game overshadowed the ominous warnings hidden within the ancient text. They now saw the brownstone not just as a prison, but as the potential site of their liberation. However, Alex's deliberate omission of the willing heart clause was a poison chalice, leading them down a path far more perilous than they could imagine. Their planning became frantic. They moved with a stealth they hadn't possessed before, fueled by the adrenaline of impending freedom. Mark, as Sarah, meticulously gathered the rare botanical components Alex had subtly introduced into the house, meticulously identifying them against the book's illustrations. She stole small vials and mortars from Alex's aromatherapy kit, repurposed for their desperate task. Sarah, as Mark, though still deeply unsettled, focused on understanding the complex incantations, practicing the archaic syllables in hushed whispers when Alex was out. The selected night for the ritual was a full moon, its luminous glow casting long, eerie shadows across the Brooklyn skyline. Alex had conveniently announced he would be working late on a crucial business trip, a calculated move to give them the privacy they needed for their desperate attempt. He wanted them to believe they had outsmarted him, only to pull the rug out from under them at the last possible moment. That evening, the tension in the brownstone was almost unbearable. Mark as Sarah and Sarah as Mark prepared the living room. They drew protective symbols on the floor with salt, mirroring the book's diagrams. They arranged the herbs, lit candles, and placed the silver ring, Sarah's heirloom, the conduit, in the center of their makeshift altar. The air was thick with the scent of unfamiliar herbs and the metallic tang of fear. "Are you sure about this, Mark?" Sarah, as Mark, whispered, his voice trembling as he looked at the complex symbols. "What if something goes wrong?" Mark, as Sarah, though equally terrified, projected an uncharacteristic bravado. "It has to work, Sarah. This is our only chance. We can't live like this anymore. We'll be ourselves again." She took Sarah's, Mark's, hand, the unfamiliar touch a stark reminder of their swapped identities. As the moon reached its zenith, casting a silver shaft of light through the living room window, they began the ritual. Mark, as Sarah, holding the ring, began to chant the ancient incantation, her voice surprisingly steady. Sarah, as Mark, echoed him, their combined voices filling the room with an ethereal hum. The candles flickered wildly, and the air crackled with an unseen energy. A faint light began to emanate from the silver ring, growing steadily brighter, pulsating with an intense, almost painful glow. The symbols on the floor shimmered, and the very air around them seemed to thicken, vibrating with an immense power. They felt a dizzying pull, a sensation of their souls being stretched, tugged, pulled from their current vessels. A wave of nausea washed over them both. Their vision blurred, the room spinning around them. They felt a profound disorientation, as if their very essence was being ripped from its moorings. It was a sensation of both agony and exhilarating liberation. They were going home. Then, just as the light reached its blinding peak, the front door clicked open. Alex stood in the doorway, a chillingly calm figure against the backdrop of the flickering candlelight. He wasn't on a business trip. He had been watching them, observing their every move, letting them believe they were in control. A triumphant, yet darkly sinister, smile spread across his face. "So," Alex said, his voice cutting through the ethereal hum of the ritual, "you thought you could simply undo my work, did you? Foolish." Mark, as Sarah, and Sarah, as Mark, froze, their eyes wide with terror. The ritual faltered, the light from the ring dimming slightly. Alex's presence, his undeniable control, shattered their fragile hope. "You see," Alex continued, stepping further into the room, "the book speaks of a willing heart. The original soul must consent to the return. And I, as the orchestrator of this little drama, certainly don't consent for you to simply waltz back into your old lives without facing the true consequences." He held up a small, intricately carved wooden box, similar in style to the ancient book. "This," he explained, "is what the book truly meant by unintended consequences when a reversal is attempted without the original wielder's consent." As he spoke, the light from the silver ring flared once more, but this time, it was different. It wasn't the pure, restorative glow they had felt before. It pulsed with an angry, chaotic energy. The air became heavy, charged with a malevolent force. "You wanted to switch back?" Alex chuckled, a chilling sound. "Be careful what you wish for." He opened the wooden box. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was another ring identical to Sarah's, but crafted from a dark, obsidian-like stone. As he opened the box, a thin, almost invisible tendril of dark smoke snaked out, curling towards the flickering silver ring. Mark, as Sarah, and Sarah, as Mark, screamed simultaneously, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. The world around them began to distort violently. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor to ripple. Their bodies convulsed, a painful, agonizing tremor running through every nerve. The light from the silver ring exploded outwards, engulfing them both in a blinding flash. A cacophony of sound filled the room, a high-pitched shriek, a guttural roar, and the distinct, sickening sound of tearing fabric, of something profound being ripped apart. When the light faded, the room was silent. The candles were extinguished, leaving only the pale moonlight filtering through the window. The salt symbols on the floor were scattered, as if a violent wind had swept through. Alex stood unmoved, a chillingly calm observer. His eyes scanned the room, settling on the two figures now lying on the floor, where Mark as Sarah and Sarah as Mark had been. But they weren't Mark and Sarah. Not entirely. One figure, now in Sarah's body, stirred. She slowly pushed herself up, her movements awkward, almost puppet-like. Her eyes, once intelligent and vibrant, were now vacant, unfocused, darting around the room with a terrifying lack of comprehension. She spoke, but it wasn't Sarah's voice, nor Mark's. It was a garbled whisper, a jumble of incoherent sounds. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled, and she collapsed back onto the floor, a single, silent tear rolling down her cheek. The other figure, now in Mark's body, also began to move. He slowly lifted his head, his face a mask of primal confusion. He looked at his hands, then at Alex, then back at his hands, his brow furrowed in a deep, agonizing frown. His eyes held a flicker of recognition, but it was quickly extinguished, replaced by an empty stare. He tried to speak, but only a low growl escaped his lips, a sound more animal than human. Alex knelt down, his gaze cold and unwavering. He picked up the silver ring, now dull and lifeless. The reversal ritual had indeed worked, but not in the way they had intended. The unintended consequences were far more profound, far more devastating. Their souls had indeed returned to their rightful bodies, but the process, without Alex's consent and with the interference of the dark ring, had fractured them. They were shells of their former selves, their minds shattered, their identities irrevocably broken. Alex stood up, a deep, resonant sigh escaping his lips. He looked at the two broken figures on the floor, his revenge complete. He had taken away their identities, their sanity, their very souls. He had destroyed them, not just for their betrayal, but for the callous disregard they had shown for his life, his love. The game was over. And Alex, the silent orchestrator, had won. The brownstone was quiet once more, but now it held the chilling echoes of two shattered lives. The living room, once a stage for elaborate deceit, now bore witness to its devastating aftermath. The scent of extinguished candles mingled with a faint, metallic tang that seemed to cling to the air, a phantom residue of shattered souls. Alex stood over the two figures, his expression devoid of triumph, replaced instead by a chilling emptiness. His revenge was complete, but the silence that followed was not one of satisfaction, but of a profound, cold desolation. Sarah, now in her own body, lay motionless, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. They were her eyes, Alex recognized, but the intelligent spark, the mischievous glint, the warmth he had once cherished were gone. They were vacant, reflecting nothing, seeing nothing. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her limbs, but otherwise, she was still, a doll-like figure stripped of its animating spirit. When Alex gently touched her hand, there was no response, no flicker of recognition. She was there, yet not there, a ghost in her own skin. Mark, too, was a grotesque parody of his former self. His powerful physique was now host to a mind lost in a fog of incomprehension. He thrashed weakly, mumbling incoherent sounds, his eyes glazed over with a primal fear. He tried to speak, to form words, but only guttural noises escaped his lips, a mournful lament of a consciousness forever fractured. He was a man reduced to his most basic instincts, his ambition, his intellect, his very personality, utterly annihilated. Alex looked at them, a strange mixture of emotions swirling within him. He had sought vengeance, had meticulously orchestrated their downfall, but the sight of their brokenness did not bring the elation he had anticipated. Instead, a heavy weight settled in his chest, a realization of the irreversible damage he had wrought. He had wanted them to suffer, yes, but not to become this. He carefully gathered the remnants of the ritual, the scattered salt, the wilted herbs, the dull silver ring. The obsidian ring, the catalyst for their ultimate destruction, he placed back into its wooden box, its dark presence a chilling reminder of the power he had wielded. The logical, calculating part of Alex's mind immediately began to construct a narrative for the outside world. He called 911, reporting a sudden, unexplained medical emergency. He fabricated a story of them suffering some kind of bizarre, simultaneous neurological event. He was convincing, his voice steady, his composure unnerving. The paramedics arrived quickly, their faces etched with confusion and concern as they assessed Sarah and Mark. They questioned Alex, who maintained his calm, sorrowful demeanor, spinning his tale of sudden collapse, of incomprehensible tragedy. He spoke of Sarah's recent stress at work and Mark's intense professional pressure. The medical professionals, baffled by the strange, non-responsive state of the two individuals, could only hypothesize. They were swiftly transported to a hospital, their fate sealed in the sterile confines of medical uncertainty. In the days that followed, Alex performed the role of the devastated husband with chilling perfection. He visited Sarah daily, sitting by her bedside, holding her unresponsive hand, his face a mask of grief. He answered questions from doctors, from concerned friends, from baffled colleagues, always maintaining the same narrative, a tragic, inexplicable breakdown. Sarah was diagnosed with a severe, irreversible form of catatonia, her mind lost in an unknown abyss. Mark, similarly, was deemed to be in a permanent vegetative state, his brain activity minimal, his prognosis grim. The news spread through their social circles like wildfire. The once vibrant, successful couple and their equally prominent colleague had been struck down by an unknown affliction. Sympathy poured in, but beneath it lay a current of morbid fascination, of whispered theories. No one, not even their closest friends, could fathom the true, dark source of their misfortune. Alex, however, carried the burden of his knowledge. He walked through their once-shared home, every corner a ghost of a memory. He saw Sarah in every delicate ornament, in every well-loved book, in the vibrant colors she had chosen for their walls. But the Sarah he saw was the Sarah he had loved, not the shattered husk he had created. He had eradicated the betrayal, yes, but in doing so, he had also eradicated the woman he married. The price of his revenge was absolute desolation. He often returned to his study, to the ancient book and the obsidian ring. He reread the passages, searching for answers, for a shred of understanding, for a way to undo what he had done. But the reversal ritual was explicitly clear. Once fractured, a soul could not be easily mended. The unintended consequences were indeed irreversible. One evening, he sat in the living room, the spot where the ritual had taken place. The moonlight streamed through the window, illuminating the faint traces of salt that still clung to the floorboards. He felt a profound emptiness, a chilling isolation. He had sought justice, had delivered a punishment he believed they deserved. But the victory felt hollow, devoid of any real triumph. He thought of the love he had lost, the years of happiness that had been shattered by a single act of betrayal. He thought of the frantic, desperate looks on Sarah, as Mark, and Mark's as Sarah's, faces as they attempted the ritual, their last grasp at hope. He had watched them, had allowed them to believe they could escape, only to pull the rug out from under them in the most devastating way possible. Alex realized, with a chilling clarity, that he too was a victim of his own making. He had become a ghost in his own life, haunted by the echoes of what once was, and tormented by the monstrous act he had committed. He had sought to destroy their love, but in doing so, he had destroyed his own soul. The silence in the brownstone was no longer comforting. It was a crushing weight, a constant reminder of the two shattered lives and the one man who had orchestrated their annihilation. The drama had ended, not with a bang, but with the hollow whisper of irreversible ruin. The super story you wanted had indeed delivered its twisted justice, but at a cost that transcended mere revenge. Alex had won the battle, but lost the war for his own humanity. Life, in its relentless march, slowly began to reform around Alex, but it was a life devoid of its former vibrancy, a pale imitation shadowed by the irreversible past. The Brooklyn brownstone became his gilded cage, a monument to his chilling revenge. Sarah remained in a long-term care facility, a permanent resident of a world only she could perceive. Mark was transferred to a similar institution, his existence a silent, vegetative testament to a fate worse than death. The city, oblivious to the arcane drama that had unfolded, continued its ceaseless hum. Alex, outwardly composed, became a shell of his former self. He continued his work, his days filled with the mundane tasks of a successful businessman, but his heart remained a desolate landscape. His once sharp intellect, honed by years of strategic thinking, was now consumed by a constant, internal monologue, replaying the events of that fateful night. He meticulously maintained the illusion of grief, offering polite, distant condolences to friends, accepting their pity with a practiced grace. But beneath the surface of his carefully constructed facade, a profound emptiness gnawed at him. He had sought closure, a sense of justice, but the absolute annihilation of Sarah and Mark brought him no peace. Instead, he was haunted by their vacant eyes, by the guttural sounds Mark now made, by the chilling stillness of Sarah. He had intended to inflict suffering, to make them live with their betrayal, but their current state offered no such satisfaction. They were beyond suffering, beyond comprehension. He often found himself drawn to the ancient book, Echoes of the Soul. He no longer sought answers, but rather a form of morbid self-flagellation. He reread the passages describing the unintended consequences of a forced reversal, each word a searing brand on his consciousness. The book became his confessor, a silent witness to his descent into darkness. The obsidian ring, the instrument of their final doom, remained in its wooden box, its very presence a cold, palpable weight in his study. The subtle changes in Alex became noticeable, even to those who were not privy to his dark secret. He became more withdrawn, less inclined to social gatherings. His once sharp wit dulled, replaced by a brooding silence. His gaze often seemed distant, haunted, as if he were constantly seeing something no one else could. Friends attributed it to the trauma of losing his wife, to the stress of her ongoing, mysterious illness. No one suspected the truth. One afternoon, Eleanor Vance, Sarah's former boss, paid Alex a visit. She was a shrewd, perceptive woman, and her concern for Sarah was genuine. "Alex," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I still can't shake the feeling that something more happened to Sarah." Her personality shift was so dramatic, so unlike her. And Mark, for two people to experience such a sudden, severe decline at the same time, it's just unsettling. Alex maintained his composure, offering the same vague explanations, the same expressions of helpless sorrow. "It was a medical anomaly, Eleanor. The doctors are baffled. We just have to accept it." Eleanor, however, looked directly at him, her gaze piercing. "I also heard a whisper from some of Mark's colleagues. They said he was behaving strangely in the weeks leading up to this. Distracted, almost like he wasn't himself." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "It's almost as if they were both someone else in their own bodies." Alex felt a jolt of ice shoot through him, but he quickly masked it. "Eleanor, I understand your concern, but I assure you it was a medical tragedy. There's nothing more to it." Eleanor sighed, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment too long. "Perhaps," she said, her voice laced with an unspoken meaning. "But some things, Alex, cast very long shadows." After she left, Alex stood by the window, staring out at the cityscape, his mind reeling. Had someone suspected? Had his carefully constructed facade begun to crack? The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine. He had eliminated the immediate threat, but the lingering echoes of his act, the subtle ripples in the fabric of their lives, were far harder to control. He visited Sarah that week. Her room was stark, sterile, filled with the soft whir of machines. He sat beside her, holding her hand, tracing the faint lines on her palm. He looked at her face, the face he had once adored, now a blank canvas of emptiness. He remembered their wedding day, the joy, the promises, the boundless hope. And he remembered the crushing weight of her betrayal, the fury that had driven him to wield such terrible power. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "are you in there somewhere? Do you remember anything?" There was no response, only the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow for her, not entirely. It was a tear for the man he had once been, the man who had loved, who had laughed, who had believed in a future untainted by deceit and dark magic. That man was gone, replaced by this hollow, vengeful specter. The silence of Sarah's room, like the silence of his home, was a constant, unforgiving presence. He had won his revenge, but lost his peace. He had broken them, but in doing so, he had irrevocably broken himself. The drama had ended, but its true tragedy, the slow, agonizing realization of his own irreparable damage, was only just beginning to unfold. The echoes of his actions would haunt him, a perpetual, silent scream in the chambers of his own tormented soul. Years bled into a quiet, monotonous blur for Alex. The whispers surrounding Sarah and Mark's mysterious conditions eventually faded, replaced by the relentless current of new tragedies, new gossip. Their brownstone, once a beacon of modern elegance, now felt like a mausoleum, its expensive furnishings gathering the dust of forgotten joy. Alex maintained his life, his work, his outward appearance of a man who had weathered an unimaginable storm, but inside, he was an empty expanse, a landscape ravaged by his own fire. He continued his visits to Sarah and Mark, a macabre pilgrimage he couldn't stop. Sarah remained in her catatonic state, a living statue. Mark's condition, if anything, had worsened, his physical health slowly deteriorating as his mind remained lost. Alex would sit by their bedsides, sometimes for hours, not speaking, just observing. He wasn't seeking remorse from them, they were incapable of it. He was, in a twisted way, seeking it from himself, but found only a vast, chilling void. The ancient book, Echoes of the Soul, remained in his study, a forbidden scripture he could neither discard nor fully embrace. He no longer reread it for answers, but for the haunting confirmation of his power and the terrifying cost of wielding it. The obsidian ring, the final catalyst for their destruction, lay in its box, a small, dark stone holding the weight of shattered souls. Alex's own life became a carefully curated performance. He avoided deep connections, fearing that any genuine intimacy would expose the monstrous secret he harbored. He dated occasionally, but the relationships were superficial, always ending when the other person sought a deeper bond. He was a master of evasion, a recluse in plain sight, perpetually guarding the desolate fortress of his heart. He often walked the streets of Brooklyn at night, the vibrant energy of the city a stark contrast to the stillness within him. He saw young lovers laughing, families strolling, friends sharing drinks, and felt a pang of something akin to longing, quickly extinguished by the cold certainty that such warmth was no longer his to possess. He had eradicated betrayal, but he had also eradicated love, joy, and the simple human connection that made life meaningful. One particularly cold winter evening, years after the incident, Alex found himself back in the living room, staring at the faint, almost invisible, traces of the salt symbols on the floor. He remembered the blinding flash, the shrieks, the sickening tearing sound. He remembered the triumphant surge of power, followed by the chilling realization of what he had truly done. He picked up the obsidian ring from its box. It felt cold, heavy, humming with a faint, malevolent energy that only he could perceive. He held it in his palm, turning it over and over. What if there was a way? A way to undo it all? Not to restore them to their former selves. He knew that was impossible, but perhaps to find some semblance of peace for himself. He reread the final, most cryptic passage of Echoes of the Soul, a warning about the ultimate cost of soul manipulation. It spoke of the wielder's soul being irrevocably tethered to the fate of the manipulated. For in the weaving of another's destiny, a thread of one's own is forever entwined. And if that destiny is broken, so too shall be the weaver's peace. A profound, terrifying understanding washed over Alex. His victory hadn't been absolute. He hadn't just destroyed Sarah and Mark, he had condemned himself. His peace, his very soul, was now inextricably linked to their brokenness. He was bound to them, forever haunted by the emptiness he had created. His revenge was not a release, but a perpetual, self-inflicted torment. He looked at the obsidian ring, then at his own reflection in the window, illuminated by the distant city lights. The man staring back was gaunt, his eyes hollow, etched with a grief that went beyond mere loss. He was a survivor, yes, but a survivor of a war he had waged against his own humanity. In a sudden, desperate impulse, Alex placed the obsidian ring on his own finger. A searing pain shot through him, a jolt of pure, raw energy. He felt a dizzying pull, a sensation of his own essence being stretched, frayed, like an ancient tapestry unraveling. The room spun, and the faint, garbled whispers of Sarah and Mark seemed to echo in his mind, not as separate entities, but as fragments of his own consciousness. He collapsed onto the floor, the ring burning against his skin. He had wanted to understand, to somehow sever the link, but he had only deepened his own damnation. He felt a profound sense of disorientation, a blurring of his own identity. The lines between his mind and the fractured echoes of Sarah and Mark began to dissolve. When the sun rose over Brooklyn the next morning, casting its warm glow over the brownstone, the living room was silent. The obsidian ring lay on the floor, its dark gleam catching the light. Alex was there too, lying motionless beside it. His eyes were open, staring at the ceiling, just like Sarah's. There was no terror, no recognition, no spark of intellect. Only a vacant, chilling emptiness. The superstory had indeed delivered its twisted justice, but the final twist was not for the lovers. It was for the orchestrator, the man who had believed he could play God. Alex had sought absolute victory, and in doing so, he had achieved absolute annihilation, not just of his betrayers, but of himself. His revenge had not freed him, it had consumed him, making him another silent, broken echo in the desolate brownstone. The price of his victory was his own soul, forever tethered to the shattered remnants of his hate. The shifting sands of deceit had finally claimed them all.